Test.
Can you hear me? I think I'm getting arthritis in my left thumb. Is that possible? Like this thumb.
Could be just RSI from the phone.
Well, that's what but I don't use I'm right-handed, so it's worse.
Yeah, but I am too, but I'm getting my left hand. It's from the phone.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, yeah, I hold it, I squeeze it. No, it's from the phone. I have to stay away from my phone. Oh, hello. How are you?
A little fatoutsed at the moment, but I will get there. Fatoutsed. Is that a word?
It's a Yiddish word. It was the favorite word of my cousin who lived around the corner from you, who died.
I had lived in New York for like 20 years, so I kind of picked some things up. Where are we? I'm just making sure I got my text up. So I forgot to print it, but I can read it off the screen. It should work out okay.
I'm reading off the screen.
Yeah.
What was I going to say? Yeah, I'm very, I'm the only thing I'm concerned about is figuring out how to go for 3 hours. But
it goes as long as it goes, as I understand it, and
it goes as long as it goes, and actually I have endless notes. I have endless things to say, and there's lots of parts, right? So
yeah. Well, you can talk about Kathy Acker, I know.
I think we should talk about Kathy, right, as well as Kathy's work, because the book is also about Kathy, and we'll figure out how to arrange that.
Yeah. All right. So just let me. Okay.
I do think I want to talk about how you and I know each other, and the kind of like I said, the genesis of I'm very into you, and then the genesis of this book, because it's.
How long ago was that meeting we had in Chelsea? I was trying to figure that out. That's the first time I met you, yeah?
Yes, it must have been. So it would have been 17 years ago, maybe 2003, 2004.
Wasn't that, wasn't it? Yeah.
Well, it was after Kathy died. I had gone through all her papers, which were a lot of papers. I had found your correspondence.
And because it came out 2015, but as I recall, it took 7 years to get the book out.
It took 7 years because it was at the other press, Lydia Yuknevich's press.
Yeah, we don't need to get into that, but I was just trying to
we don't have to, but Yeah, it took a long time.
Oh,
yeah,
God.
it took a long time. But I think also, when we can talk about it, there was, it's such an intimate book. I think we both felt tender and cautious about it, rightly so, right?
Yeah. I took a bit of persuading.
Okay, so we are live now, just so everyone knows that what is being said is streaming out to the world. Hi, McKenzie, I'm Steph. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Steph.
I'm the voiceless red cat circle, or the red cat circle. So I'm gonna mute
your pain.
I'm gonna mute everyone and play the red cat video, and then Arna will get into his introduction. Great. Okay, here we go. And test, great.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this virtual conversation at Red Cat. My name is Arne de Boever. I am the director of the MA Aesthetics and Politics program that's housed in the School of Critical Studies at the California Institute of the Arts. Every year, during a time of the academic year that's called Winter Session, we host a distinguished critical and creative thinker as our theorist in residence. And this year, we are very fortunate that Professor McKenzie Wark was able to join us. Professor Wark teaches culture and media at Eugene Lang College, the undergraduate liberal arts division of the New School in New York. And this week, she is participating in 2 public events with us. The one you're attending today about the low theory of Kathy Acker, and then another one on Friday, which we're going to run through our program's YouTube channel. That lecture will be titled The Cis Gaze. This is also an opportunity for our program to spotlight some of the excellent faculty we have working with our students. Today, McKenzie will be joined by my colleague, Matthias Wiegner, an artist, writer, and specialist of all things Acker and much more. And then on Friday, my colleague, Andrea Fontenot, who teaches feminism, gender studies, and queer theory at CalArts, will be introducing McKenzie's lecture and moderating the Q&A afterwards. I should also mention that McKenzie is teaching a closed seminar for CalArts students this week as well. Yesterday, we had the first session of that seminar on McKenzie's book, Capital is Dead. Is this something worse? The book is a study of what comes after capitalism, what some have called neoliberalism or financial capitalism or simply finance, a mode of production for which McKenzie argues we may need a different name. She actually argues that coming up with such a new name would mean to work in solidarity with Marx's own project, which in its analysis of capitalism sought to name a new mode of production as well. The era after capitalism is the one that began in the early 1970s and in which value no longer comes from making things, but from managing and controlling information. I think it's worth noting that as a history that runs kind of parallel to the rise of conceptual art. And art's implication in that history is certainly something worth considering all the way up to the present. For the second seminar session, which will be next Monday, we're going to be reading excerpts from McKenzie's recent books, Molecular Red and also General Intellect. It's kind of amazing how prolific McKenzie's been. I'm kind of interested in her own mode of production, to be honest. The conversation today is going to be, as I already mentioned, about McKenzie's forthcoming book on Acker's low theory, So we're getting kind of the scoop on that today. And then the material that she will present in Friday's public lecture is new as well. So all of this to say that you're in for a real treat. Before I hand it off to Matthias, I just want to say a few more things. We owe a big thank you to the Finance and Fiction Research Unit at the University of Copenhagen, which helped to make this residency possible. Our program has been involved in a collaborative research project with several scholars there, and this week's events are a direct result from that collaboration. So a big thank you to our friends and comrades over there. On Thursday, we are hosting a mini conference, open to all, by the way, about Sentient Flesh, the new and monumental book by the Black Studies scholar R.A. Judy. R.A. is going to be doing 2 readings from the book, and my colleague Andrew Culp has also scheduled several conversations about the book on the same day. So please also do join us for that if you can. And then finally, our visiting artist coordinator, Steph Smith, who with Pete Pace and others here at Red Cat, has, with her usual clarity of mind, supported the technical side of what's happening today, has asked me to direct you to the chat on the right-hand side of your video window. There you can discuss with others what's going on in the talk and also record your questions. And so Steph is going to keep an eye on those and pass them on to Matthias for the Q&A. I think that's it as far as I'm concerned. Matthias, McKenzie, over to you.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with McKenzie, who I've known now for some 15 years. We were just discussing how we know each other, and maybe I'll just start with that narrative because it's a simple one. So I'm Kathy Acker's literary executor and head of her literary trust, and after she died, and when I'd finally gone through her many papers and kind of organized them to the degree that I could, and they're still not fully organized. They're at Duke University and at NYU, and they're still a treasure trove, by the way, for researchers. I found a printed out correspondence, email correspondence between McKenzie Wark and Kathy Acker, and it was a really personal, compelling text, very funny, very informal. Kathy's voice, for me, her speaking voice, the way she talked about things, really echoed through. It echoes through in her work, but it had a very distinctive, I recognized the Kathy I knew really well, and McKenzie kept up with Kathy, which is not easy, right? And everyone who knew Kathy, Kathy was to say she was articulate would be an understatement, right? Really like hyperbolic, lavish, also could be very understated, but a wonderful conversational companion. So I looked at this, and we didn't have any new books of Kathy's to surprise the public with and publish after she died, which is one of the things you do, right, to get attention to a dead author. But we did have this. So I don't even remember, McKenzie, how it went, but I don't think I asked you by email. I think I just arranged to meet you when I was in New York, and we started talking about the correspondence, and then I finally kind of pitched it to you as a book, right? And we sat there going back and forth about it, and some of the reasons we went back and forth about it is it's really personal. It was never meant to be published. Kathy would never have published it in her lifetime. We had to edit a lot of things because it was very unguarded. There was a lot of stuff about other people, right? So we had to change names. We had to edit it, and then somewhere in the process we gave it. And I write about this in my preface. We gave it to someone we both really love and respect, to kind of write an introduction for one of the great American novelists, and that person looked at it and declined, saying that it was too personal and we shouldn't publish it. It was saying that it was like rooting through someone's underwear drawer, which it is. I mean, it's not an inaccurate assessment. And then that was like another kind of hitch. And finally, it was published in 2015 as "I'm very into you." And "I'm very into you" is a phrase that I pulled from Kathy's email when finally. So this is a great flirtation. This correspondence, right? And it has a lot of characteristics that anyone who was alive in the mid-90s would recognize about both about cultural references, literary cultural references, but also the kind of newness of email and the way you could very quickly talk to somebody on the other side of the world. So that the book came out, and McKenzie and I became friends, I think, in that process. And then 2 years ago, I curated an exhibition on Kathy in Germany, the first solo exhibition on Kathy, and it involved Kathy in relation to contemporary art, and kind of looking at Kathy's literary production in a way that was not making a claim for it as art production, but looking at kind of the diversity of form, the use of images and imagery in particular, the use of archives and books and other texts, and included in that was, or concluding that exhibition, was a symposium. And I knew that McKenzie would have to be included in that, and probably was the first person we invited. And we started kind of talking about, as I recall, you have to correct me here, we started talking about the exhibition, a lot of which the exhibition itself began in a focus on Kathy's The Childlike Life of the Black Tarantula. That was the opening room, and it was kind of the framing or the introduction to Kathy's work in the exhibition. It's also Kathy's first real published work, right? And the sort of spideriness, let's say, of that text, right, influenced McKenzie's presentation for the symposium, and in a remarkable way generated the book we're talking about today. And that's sort of my way of introducing the book. McKenzie, maybe you want to talk about either both "I'm very into you" or just the generation of philosophy for spiders.
Yeah, I knew Kathy Acker very briefly and very intensely in 1995, 96. And she knew a lot of people very briefly and very intensely. So it's not a unique story in any sense at all. It's just one that happens to be documented in a certain way. Because we did email, only 5% of American households had email in 1995, like I looked this up. And the average number of emails anybody got was 5. And there was the two of us sending 5 to each other a day or night. The other thing was we both emailed from home, and that was, I think, much rarer. I'd figured it out through the university. Kathy, because she was in the Bay Area, had people who'd hooked her up. And I kind of kept the emails and I put them in a document, and I printed 2 copies, one of which I sent to Kathy and the other of which I kept. My copy is now actually lost, I think, because my brother cleaned out my storage unit without telling me. So that's the only copy of that. And it's a complete record of our emails up until I met up with her again in San Francisco and New York City. And I think it's 96. We emailed after that. I lost all those except the last one. And that's the last, heartbreaking to me email that's in the end of the book. And the last email is based on a bit of Calvino. And when I was at the show in Karlsruhe, I found a draft of that email in her copy of that book in the show. And it just completely destroyed me. That's doing that conference, the symposium, is one of the hardest things I ever did for all sorts of reasons. I had a massive panic attack and I was like huddled under my coat before the show. It was intense, but you asked me to do that symposium really now 3 years ago, because there was a very, very long lead time for that show. And I thought, fuck, I'm now an Acker person. I better actually read all of the books. Because I was familiar with her work, but I was by no means qualified to talk about her body of work. And I think one of the reasons she and I got together was I respected her as a writer, but I wasn't a huge fan. Like, I think she had huge fans in Sydney that she was keeping at bay. And I clearly respected her writing and knew it, but I was kind of like, it wasn't in that sort of category. So I think that sort of made me available to her. And also her like horoscope person had told her she would meet somebody that day. So, and we were at dinner. So of course that was how that worked out. Yeah, and I happened to be on leave in 2018. So I thought, oh, I'll read all of Kathy Acker. And then I felt like I had something to say about it. And there are some magnificent books on Kathy by Georgina Colby and by Douglas Martin. I feel like are two of the best. Chris Kraus had written her memoir. There's several other scholarly accounts of her work. Sorry, I can't remember everybody's names at the moment to name check them all. But I feel like I had something a little different to that to say, which was sort of Kathy as a theorist. And the book's about, low theory in a sense. It's somebody who's attempting to construct concepts about everyday life. And the way you set up that show around the spider thing and her being the black tarantula as one of her many pseudonyms from the early days of her work was enabling to me, because I thought there isn't like a consistent, the philosophy of Kathy Acker is not a thing, because her self is itself variable and in flux. There's a network of Kathys. She's not anybody. There's a sort of relation between the various ways that she thinks and feels. So to have like a web or a mesh of Kathy's kind of thinking through, and philosophy in three parts, really. There's a phenomenology of the body in Kathy Acker, centered on experiences that are sometimes talked about in philosophy, but not very centrally. A lot of it's about masturbation, for example. A lot of it's about rape. There's a sort of phenomenology of desire, of relation to the other. And there's a lot in that about the possible instability of one's own gender and in relation to desire for the other. And I found that incredibly enabling as somebody who was transitioning at the time. And I think as a trans writer, you're always looking for writers who make space for us. There's trans literature, but who are the other writers for whom there's a space for us? And I'm not making the claim that Kathy was trans, but she was definitely somebody for whom the instability of gender was a reality that she felt and worked with. But I also think there's what I call a third philosophy in Kathy, which is mostly about the city, but also about post-capitalism. Like, it surprised me to go back. And it's like, wait a minute, she was writing about post-capitalism a lot. And you might know where she got that from. To me, it smacks a little bit of Pasolini. We talked about neo-capitalism. We know she was reading Jean Baudrillard and various people who are trying to think through how capitalism had mutated. And she was in three of the cities where you could say it was most visibly felt, right? She was in New York, London, and the Bay Area, where whatever this new mode of production and its relation to art, as Arnie mentioned, was very real. And then there's also a philosophy of nature in Acker that I'm not aware of anybody.
That's the most surprising, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, wow, like, and it makes sense. Like, there's a way in which her work is about a connection to the mythic, which is the moment of instability and potential and chaos before narrative begins. Maybe a bit like Kristeva's Cora, but I didn't want to make her dependent on famous names. Like, that's a kind of scholarship that happens where you read somebody and then you apply Kristeva or somebody to it, and that's valid, but I don't want to do that. So I don't talk about her precursors much at all. Yeah, so that's how it happened, and that's the project. And so I call it philosophy for spiders, for those of us who, it is a kind of way of thinking for people who think a little bit outside of a formal sort of academic space, because we need theory outside of academia now, right? And then I sort of conclude the book a little bit more personally with one of the readings I think you can add to Acker because there's a feminist reading of Acker, a queer reading of Acker, a postmodern reading of Acker, a punk reading of Acker, an avant-garde reading of, and they're all valid, right? Like what makes a writer great is sustaining a variety of readings, yeah? But there's a way in which they sort of box her a little bit into particular things. And I didn't want to just say, there's also a trans reading of Acker. But so the book sort of ends with that as one of the ways you could open up the text, that the awareness of the possibility of the awareness that being cis is only one mode of being is actually the thing I definitely say is there in the Acker text. And that was sort of enabling. I found so many trans writers for whom Acker is a touchstone, and I really wanted to explore that, and that sort of concludes the book. There's been hinted at once or twice by other writers, but I think the trans reading of Acker is relatively novel.
I was going to begin with the end, but I actually want to. So just to describe the book a little bit, the Philosophy for Spiders. Perhaps a third of the text or a quarter is actually a memoir, right? It's the let's say the backstory of I'm very into you. It's meeting Kathy. A lot of it is about having sex with Kathy, which is quite beautiful, and I'd like to talk about it because one of the things that Kathy and I talked about a lot was pornography. We were both very interested in pornography, text or literary pornography in particular. And also a thing that we at that point, and I think we still call it the same thing, we were calling sex writing, right? Which was covered similar territory as pornography, but had a very different purpose, right? The purpose of pornography is arousal, right? It's a kind of manipulation of a reader. Sex writing does something different, right? Which is it writes, and Dennis Cooper was, I think, the person that when Kathy and I talked about it was the writer we often cited, where sex would become part of the narrative, and while very conscious that the primary entry point for sex in narrative has always been pornography, sex writing tries to do something else, right? It tries to talk about what happens in that bed or on that table or in that kitchen. And that's a very beautiful part of the text. And maybe we could talk about, maybe we could start about talking about Kathy. So there's two parts of this text, right? Which is Kathy the person, and then Kathy's texts. And they're discrete, but of course it's very hard to separate them. And one of the things you just said resonated very much with me, which is the way that I knew Kathy was quite similar to the way you knew Kathy in the beginning, which is I knew her work somewhat. I wasn't a big fan. I thought it was interesting work. And I think also I was able to become friends with her because I was not in a fan position, right? I was in a kind of a readerly position, right? We were both readers, and like the way that I met Kathy was via books, in the sense that I met Kathy came to LA about 1989, about 10 years before she died. Came to LA, was visiting in LA, and Dennis Cooper threw a party for her, and I was invited, and I was young and shy, and I'm old and shy now. And I did the thing that I would always do at a party when I didn't know who to talk to or what to talk about, is I went to the bookshelf and I started pretending to be very interested in the books. I mean, there were always, there were obviously good, worthy books on that shelf. And then I suddenly, Kathy was next to me looking at the books, and I got something. I got a vibe off of Kathy, which is she was not comfortable either. She was shy, which she was, we started talking. It was triangulated, right? We started talking about the books, right? We started talking about the books on the shelf. We started talking about. I still can't remember which books specifically we talked about. But we talked about books, and we talked about bookshelves and the way people kind of organize their books. And Dennis had a distinctive way of organizing his books that I can't remember. And Kathy had a distinctive way, which is totally alphabetical, which I couldn't bear because I can't bear having, like, you know, a poet next to an artist next to a theorist. So I do categories, but that beginning, right? That beginning in a conversation, right? That wasn't about ourselves, right? It was triangulated, right? It was about text. It was about books, and how they kind of how deep or how intense our connection is, and I think that was your beginning in many senses.
Well, right? Not exactly, because I went to a reading that she did in Sydney, and then I was invited to the dinner because we wrote for the same magazine, and then the two of us, I don't know how accidental it was, we sat next to each other, and then we hooked up that night. So it's kind of like a slightly different story. And then for every night, you know, bar one, I think that she was in Sydney, and then the emails start. So yeah, it was a little bit different, but I think it was, the conversation was also about writing, essentially, more than literature, actually about writing. She was probably doing the last touches to Pussy King of the Pirates at the time.
Yeah.
5 books with her, and she was saying, those are the 5 books I'm working on, with Stevenson's Treasure Island on the top. Kills me I can't remember the other 4. I mean, you can figure it out from the text, but I would love to have kept that memory. But I remember I asked you, I think by email, you know, look, I'm writing about Kathy, and the first part's memoir, and it's just mostly about sex. Like, is that okay? And your answer was just literally, it's Kathy. I'm like, oh yeah, like sex writing was the thing she did. Like this was part of her life, and I'm kind of gobsmacked nobody else has really sort of done that. You know, like there are little accounts here and there, and I've gathered some of them into the book. And there's fictional accounts, of course. But the other thing was, yeah, the first part of the book is memoir. Kathy turned me out, you know, it's like, that's what I remember most about that. And in writing about it, I fact-checked everything that was fact-checkable about my own memory, and a lot of it is wrong. You know, like I thought her place in London was opposite the canal, and it's not. Like, that's a thing that you can verify, yeah? So, I wanted to write in a way that, you know, it took me years to figure out. We saw a Neil Bartlett play on the last night I spent with her. The years to figure that out, because, you know, I know a lot of queer people, but just not exactly the right queer London people who like theatre. And eventually that teased out, and I misremembered that, you know, in all sorts of weird ways. And so I kind of am trying to, this is what I remember, but here's some little hints that not to believe memoir in a sense. Because there's a lot of Kathy in her books, but it's in all of these layered ways. And of course, we both know she was a great fantasist and fabulist, and would make stories up. And stories that are true in their own way. She told me things when we were together that are really completely untrue, but they're mythically true in other ways, yeah? And that's part of it as well, of trying to craft a bit of writing at the beginning of this book that's what I remember, the very brief but very intense connection, the failure of that, and, you know, like many people failed to, or she thought had failed her in sustaining that. But yeah, the sex writing was the thing that actually then drew me back to reading all of the books, because it's powerful and original, and there's a way that she's thinking through a kind of phenomenology of the body, a sense of desire, in the act of describing both extremely good and appallingly bad sex. Like, there's also there's a reason it's not pornography also, right? There's a lot of just unbearably bad sex going on as well, and described with incredible precision, but often voiced through characters and sub-identities and things. And that's woven into all of the other textures of the writing at the same time.
Well, there's also, speaking of pornography, like in the Marquis de Sade, there's a lot of unbearably horrible and bad sex, right? And there's which Kathy, of course, knew and was really interested in, but that that has, and it's not sex writing, it's still pornography, but it's a pornography that is antagonistic, right? It instead of arousing, it wants to outrage the reader. And there's a fine line there, I would say, but or provocation. Oh, I know, I wanted to step backwards into kind of, it relates to both of us and the genesis of this book, like you. So after Kathy was, so I became Kathy's executor, not because I was a Kathy Acker scholar, but because I was really close friends, and I was with, I took care of Kathy when she died, and then like I was available. All right, I was available, and suddenly Kathy was gone, and what I had was a lot of texts, right, which I'd read some of. And so the first thing, like you, that I did is I sat down and I read all the texts, right, and was kind of entered a really remarkable space, right, that maybe only exists when you know a writer, and you sort of know their work, and then the writer is gone, right, and then what's left is the work, right, and it both is and is not the writer, and that incredible textual universe that both of us have voyaged, in a almost in a Star Trek way, right, that we voyage through, because there's parts of that universe, I think, that are still that I don't know, and the kind of trying to understand someone that way is it's a great, it's a gift, it's a remarkable experience, right? It's a gift. Like one of the things I've known, I think, 3 geniuses in my life. Kathy was one of them, right? And it's remarkable to get actually to become to get to know someone like that. And I'm rambling about this, but I have a point.
Well, I was going to say, that reminds me of the thing Sarah Schulman said. Like, she has a whole paragraph about how Kathy was a genius, but she was emotionally average. It's like, bang, and it's kind of like, it's a harsh judgment, but there's something to that. It was difficult emotionally to inhabit the same space.
Yeah, I have to, I'm going to pull up that passage from the book.
And I'd say that as someone who's emotionally probably below average anyway. Like, I'm not making any, I
feel like I've worked very hard on my emotional IQ.
But it did make it difficult, because you're dealing with this incredible intellectual energy, but kind of a minefield in some ways as well.
Very complicated person, psychologically and emotionally. All right, here's Sarah Schulman. To be a German Jew of that generation was to feel entitled and endangered. She was born Karen Alexander from the kind of family known to New York Jews as our crowd. Her family, the Alexanders, along with the Lobes, Ox, etc., were the best educated, wealthiest, and most sophisticated Jews in the world. I'm not quite sure about that. But Kathy came from a tiny ethnic group responsible for originating the most influential theories of the 20th century. Marxism, psychoanalysis, theory of relativity, postmodernism, and therein lay her problem. For emotionally, Kathy was average. She had no family. She was an abandoned, traumatized person. Artistically and intellectually, she was exceptional. Inherent in her supremacy was a certain kind of expectation. And that, of course, leads to the title, Great Expectations. But very true, right? Very true. All right, and I know where I want to go. So I want to actually start maybe with the ending, and the beginning is very personal, right? It's you and Kathy and your bodies and your genders, your many genders, right?
Too many genders.
What?
Too many.
Oh, I don't know if there can be too many genders. Facebook's got 51, and you ask which of Kathy's 51 genders would Facebook choose.
And that varied depending on the day.
Yeah. So I want to start with the afterwards, and you say you want to reclaim Kathy for a minor literature, right? For translit, the reading of and by and for trans people. And for a minute, I want to talk about a minor literature. It's a phrase, of course, that comes from Deleuze and Guattari, right? And there's three characteristics of minor literature. One is the deterritorialization of language, right? Of using of making strange, let's say, a familiar language, and often a major language, not a minor language, right? So it comes from looking at Kafka, right? Kafka, who at home spoke German and Yiddish, probably, writes in a very, very formal German, but lives in Prague, right? And lives his ordinary life in Czech. But again, it's a minor literature because it's deterritorializing German in a way, right? Second, it connects the individual to a political immediacy, right? And in Kafka's case, that political immediacy is a Weimar Germany, right? That is fraying, right? That is going to lead to a Holocaust, a world war, that is going to lead to fascism. And the third part always mystifies me in Deleuze and Guattari. And they call it a collective arrangement of utterance, right? Which I take to mean that what is being said is not especially individual, right? It relates to a collectivity. And you know, in a way, we can also you very elegantly use first philosophy, second philosophy, and third philosophy with Kathy, right, as a way of just organizing the it's not chaos, but organizing the tangle. And the real thing that I think comes from Deleuze and Guattari and their concept of a minor literature is that minor, it doesn't characterize a literature, but it describes like the revolutionary conditions, right, that any literature can within what we call established literature, right? A revolutionary potential, a revolutionary condition of a literature. And I think that's, it's so right for Kathy, right?
I feel like it's, I'd see it the other way around. It's like major literature sees its job as representation. Representation of a subject that's going to have some coherent relation to a culture and nation. And one could add gender to that, yeah? And minor literature is the escape from all of those things. So I sort of see it the other way around, and you could go all the way back to Kathy's refusal of American Jewish writing, for example. Yeah, this sense of like not doing that Philip Roth thing, don't relate, going sideways to kind of avoid being kind of categorized. She's a writer of the city, I think, in a way that cities are not nations or states or any of those things. That there's a multiplicity that enables, that's there. And I think there's kind of like layerings of and interweavings of the multiplicity of the city, of bodies, of selves is the thing that, and of layers and kinds of textuality all at the same time. So I don't know if I was interested in her fitting the strict definition, because for there to be a strict definition of minor literature would be a very un-Guattarian way to think anyway. But it struck me that her kind of refusal of a certain role and kind of construction of a somewhat different one sort of points in all of those directions.
Yeah.
And it's that I wanted to add, yeah, like, well, the instability of gender is like, let's prise that one open. Like, what does it mean to start reading where you just don't assume that the writer or the addressee of the text is cis? Like, what happens when you do that? And I'm not the first person to suggest there's a trans reading along those lines, but I wanted to apply it to Kathy, which is not, hasn't been done a whole lot.
Yeah, but and also the sort of overlap, right, of reading and writing, right, and which happens everywhere, but it happens so strongly in Kathy, because Kathy as a writer is nothing, right, without her reading, without all the other books upon which the no, it's not even upon which, right? It's not we stand on the shoulders of giants. It's really, it's kind of, we're in the bowels, right, of an existing.
You can see that in terms of what was happening in the art world at the time, of like the question of what is material and what's a process for working with material. So it's sort of not about an idea you had, or you're a fucking genius, or your relation to art history or literary. It's not about any of those things. It's like it's you in a room with a pile of books, and what's process that you have in relation to those, and use them, and it gets you out of that trap of. And because the thing I put a lot of stress on is like that little sort of Marxist thread in Kathy too, of refusal of property. You know, that sense of the writer as the proprietor of a soul, generating its own intellectual property. There's a way that, of course, like all writers, she depended on copyrights, but was sort of resistant to that as well. So I think you can layer that strand into this as a minor literature there as well.
Before we started, I was talking with Steph Smith about Marx and Kathy, and also I think Arne about your seminar yesterday, and it was always very clear to me that Kathy, like many of the people I know, was fundamentally a Marxist, in the sense that her understanding of history and the material world comes out of Marx, right? Which is that history is the product of class conflict, and that you may not accept the kind of prescriptions in Marx about what we do about like the real, right? About how our world is generated, but the understanding of history and of material reality, right, is fundamentally Marxist.
Yeah, and I don't remember which books by or about Marxism are in her library, or how annotated they are. This is not somebody who read all 3 volumes of Capital. It's not that kind of Marxism, but it's just that gut instinct that this is capitalism and it's a system of exploitation. It's all very clear when she writes about the bread shop and things like that, you know. And when she writes about sex work, it's clearly also about capitalism.
Yes.
And the way gender is through capitalism. And she adds things to this too. It's, you know, it's like, wow, these are things that weren't being publicly said in a literary form at that time. And she's sort of like adding to that. So yeah, not Marxist in that sense of, you know, like the tenured professor who's always like, but you need to read the footnote in volume 2. It's not that, you know, but in the sense of just an intuitive sense of how the commodity form works, what exploitation is. Yeah, and I wanted to get that, you know, because that's me, you know, that's how I view the world. So I wanted to get that connection in there. And also that she talks about post-capitalism, that it might have taken a turn, and the way that it starts to function on information is a thing that I hadn't actually, like, that influenced me and I forgot about it. The dedication in my Hacker Manifesto from 2004 is to Kathy, King of the Pirates, Acker. So like part of me sort of knew that I got some of this from her, but I didn't really process that. And so I feel like I'm paying a little debt of influence in a way here.
Wow. I lost my thread. One of the things that you say in the afterword, where we're still kind of in the afterword.
Oh yeah, that's where we were. Sorry.
No, it's fine. But it's your observation about Kathy, which is that the kind of the range of anthologies, right? I'm quoting you here. She's been grouped with selections of writers and writing that are downtown, transgressive, postmodern, cyberpunk, feminist, conceptual, revolutionary, new narrative, queer, and so on. And this is something that I, after I read Kathy, this is something I started noticing, which is a lot of the commentary on Kathy was from, how do I put this in a kind of a neutral way? A lot of the writing about Kathy after in her life and at the point at which she died was feminists, Deleuzians, postmodern theorists, right? I would say those three. And Kathy was like a hobby horse, right? In which they could demonstrate their theories through Kathy's work, right? So it wasn't false, it wasn't a misreading, right? But it was this kind of like, it was harnessing of an incredibly heterogenic text, right? Texts, a body of work, right? To a horse, right? Or to a carriage, really. It was the horse, which you also noticed, right? This kind of plurality of the reception, right? And it also leads into something you talk about, which is a kind of plurality, multiplicity, right? Of Ackers and Ackers in the work, right? And I think I'm sure I've talked about this with everyone I know, but one of the generative moments for me of understanding Kathy as a writer was in 2002, and it was the first conference. I don't know if you were there at NYU. After Kathy had died, it was the Lust for Life conference, and there's a book out of it. I was one of the co-organizers, but Avital Ronell, who was also, of course, a friend of Kathy's and one of the great commentators on Kathy, in the conversation, she said something which is at some point another academic had critically said to her that the problem of Kathy was the texts were too eclectic, that there were too many different texts from one writer. And Avital, in her really observant, wise way, and I didn't write it down, I have it in memory, so I don't know how she articulated it, but this is how I remember it. She said, well, that's all well and good, but Kathy Acker is not one writer, right? And that kind of...
that was really enabling for me. I think I hopefully I acknowledge Avital is where I got that from. It's like, oh, that's literally the plan for my book. It's about multiple Kathys. And I don't say Acker X, it's like the Acker web or the Acker field.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't have her essay in Lust for Life in my head. I don't know if it's in the essay.
Yeah, it's in the essay. That idea's in there. I don't know if she's responding to somebody. Yeah, and I think there were two ways you could resolve this without then sort of flattening Acker out into one thing. And another way to do it is Douglas Martin, where the plurality is in the structure of Douglas's book. And I kind of went the other way. I wanted a book that had like a through line and a structure and all that. But then, whatever Acker is has to be a thing that's a network of possibilities that fluctuate. And so rather than attribute, a thought or a perspective to Kathy, it's like, well, some Ackers this, and then some Ackers something slightly different elsewhere, but they're not random. They're connected. I think the points around which she oscillates, you can map. So they're not random thoughts at all. And so, yeah, to me, it was Douglas's book to me was the other thing that was like a breakthrough, putting that together with the thing Avital said. It's like, oh, okay, so, and like, this is the thing, like to write about an interesting writer whose interest is partly formal, you're gonna need a formal solution for your own writing. And there's a lot of Acker scholarship that I really depended on, but it tends to like flatten it into a form that nobody thought about much. And it's the form of, like responsible criticism. But I think the things that sort of really got more of an engagement with more of the sort of like the skin of it, sort of take some risks about how you would arrange a writing that's going to be alongside rather than about. I didn't want to write a book about Kathy. It's like a book that's like alongside, if you like. Like it's not, there's a way scholarship can be a little bit of a sort of authority move. And I like Kathy said to me, and I feel like I failed the test, of just be my friend. She said that to a lot of people, right? Yeah. It's elsewhere in correspondence and even in the books. And no one ever succeeded at that, actually, to my knowledge. People did a better job of it than I did. how can my book be a friend to a writer that I knew and to a body of work? Like, to me, that was sort of the question. And it meant respecting the form and not making her a pendant to Deleuzianism. I could do that. I used to be a card-carrying Deleuzian, but it's not interesting. Like, and also, why is that going to happen to a writer who is at least technically a woman, right? Or even if you're going to make her a pendant to Cixous, why is it some famous high theory French philosopher that you're going to make her a pendant to? You know, I didn't want to do that. So to what extent is she, like, contrary? That's the one thing where I am pushing back a little bit against her method, is to actually make her the beginning of something. Acknowledging that it's woven out of other voices, but the weaving itself is actually kind of special in its own particular thing.
Well, one of the things I in my notes that I have kind of on the side of my screen is that as a work of interpretation, MW does not try to top KA. Well, you know what I mean, but that is the majority of critical works, right? Your job is supposed to be to somehow tease out something that the author didn't even know was there, and thereby, right? And you know that I think a lot of work.
It's so good. I'm stealing that and putting it in the book. Yeah, because like top means a few things there that has several valences. Yeah. Like top in the sense of being better than, but also like I'm such a card-carrying bottom that, like, yeah. So I had to kind of admit that to myself, and now I have to write as one. Yeah, that's going on as well.
So lovely. But I you know, so I want to, maybe we were going to start, we're going to go to this, but you were going to read the opening section, which is a dream. But before that, I want to describe a little bit, because we talked about Douglas Martin, and I think Douglas Martin's. Let me show his share screen. Let's see. Can I? Hold on.
If you're there, Douglas, hi.
Douglas should be there. Yes.
Yeah. I can also report I had a really delightful lunch with Douglas some years ago, upstate, because we were both upstate, as you say in New York, upstate. And I kind of wanted to talk to Douglas before I even embarked on this, because this is, you know, the book I really love most on Kathy's work. It's simply called Acker by Douglas Martin.
Yeah. So I hopefully it's appearing on the screen. But Douglas Martin's book, which was his PhD dissertation, it's a lovely book, because it's almost a Barthian book, I would say, right? Because it organizes Kathy's work in kind of discrete sections that are movable, right? They don't have to be in the arrangement they're in, like a lover's discourse, but they do something similar to what your book does, right? Which is, all right, I've stopped screen. Good. And that before let's move to the reading. But one of the things I want to say about your text, which nobody will know until they pick it up, but about a third of the actual words are just Kathy, right? So it's a kind of a palimpsest. Or a cento, right? You're writing. It also reminded me in a way of Dodie Bellamy's letters of Mina Harker, right? You're writing through Kathy. You're not writing on top of or over her, right? It's an inhabitation. Also like a bird's nest, almost made of appropriated material.
At least what, a third of the book is quotes from Kathy. I write with your permission, by the way, so thank you.
Well, yeah, I never ever, as the executor, by the way, I'm happy to say this publicly, I never say no, right? It seems so antithetical to Kathy for there to be someone sitting there deciding who gets to have Kathy and who doesn't. So it's just, I I never say no. I always give permission. I hate to be, that position of police in relation to Kathy is a very uncomfortable position. But the kind of tissue of the work is, you could call it a lexicon, right? Which is both like a reading of a work and vocabulary, but it's not just a vocabulary, it's not just a lexicon, it's also a grammar of the work.
Yeah, it's organized by concepts, and that is a bit of a Deleuzian thing. So to think of Kathy as a producer of concepts and to try to identify, not all of them, but what seemed like a key network of them, and arrange them in those three layers, working outwards from the body. And obviously the body is in Acker or in, is resonating with a whole social political field. Like that's the minor literature side of it. But to sort of start there and then work out. So 1, 2, 3. Also Charles Sanders Peirce, right? Firstness, thirdness, and secondness is there in that structure of it as well. There's a little bit of what I call null philosophy at the beginning of it to give us a sense of why it's structured like that. And then at the very beginning is the memoir bit. And I'm actually really not entirely sure why I wanted to do the memoir bit in the same book. Like the memoir bit fell out of Reverse Cowgirl because I was writing the history of my transition as a sort of autofiction, and it fell out of that. And then it sort of ended up attached in this way. But maybe it's part of thinking about, I had to read a lot of queer theory, as we all did at a certain time, but a lot of it's just not hot, like it's not, wait a minute, it's all reality, but it's not hot. Like it's not, like this doesn't do anything for me. Like some of it's useful and I respect it, but I kind of, can there be a different kind of writing where and where it also would be a little dishonest to leave it out in a way, right? Because that was my connection to Kathy.
It grounds the book. Well, I think it's astonishing where it is, and it's the first third, the memoir third is very unlike the rest, but I would never separate them. I think they're astonishing together. Maybe we should. Do you want to read the dream sequence?
Yeah. So I'm just read how the book starts.
Yeah.
And this section is called The First Resort. When Kathy Acker checked in there, I knew something had changed. It's a quiet place, empty and calm, a place where nothing ever happens, like a resort hotel in the off-season. The decor is classy but generic, banal, high-end, non-place. Kathy took me by the hand and led me through the big portal doors. This was unexpected. Why was Kathy leading me to this place that is so familiar to me from my own recurring dream? I've been coming here in dreams as long as I can remember. It's always quiet and still, the light cool and mute. There seemed to be a staff keeping it running, but you never see them. There appear to be other guests, but they've just walked around a corner, or you hear laughter from the elevator as it arrives, but when it opens, it's empty. And yet there's nothing either weird or eerie about it. It always looks the same, but sometimes it's on a cliff overlooking the sea, and sometimes it's in the woods or by a lake. It always feels partly familiar to me in the dream and partly not. It's a place to go so you can temporarily not exist, a vacation from life, a non-place for non-life. That's why it's so strange that Kathy took me by the hand and brought me to this place in my dream. I was surprised that she knew about it. And I asked, but how did you know? And Kathy says, it's the place the dead make for the living. It's always here. She showed me what it is for, this resort from life and non-life alike. She showed me that the dead make it for us. The dead make a place without qualities. They make the space of dreams itself. The dead don't want us to be like them. They have nothing to give us that has any features or qualities. They just make this place for us, this generic non-place, and leave us alone. Kathy knew all about this. She came back in a dream to remind me that I have been here too. She came back to remind me why one comes here. Maybe we all visit this place, but forget all about it. The hard part is to go back and still remember what it's for. This is how it has always been for us moderns. The dead refuse to tell us anything. And so we feel like they finally left us alone, which can make us go crazy. Kathy knew where to find them. Actually, that's not true. Nobody knows. She was one of the ones who knew where to find their absence. She found the place they had left, that they left for us. You can come here and be in their absence and come back. Let's go.
So there's a beautiful kind of play between presence and absence in that dream and in that text. So this was a real dream. I'm
True story. Yeah. As it is with all, it's a palimpsest of the dream, right? But I wrote it down, and here I've tidied it up a bit. But true story. It happened. Yeah, and it really freaked me out.
Did it happen more than once?
That Kathy came? No, just the once.
It was a one-time dream. Yeah. Kathy occasionally makes an appearance in my dreams too. And it's, she's, it's interesting. They're not sad. They're not sad. She's busy in a new place. And also, this is a really weird aside, but sometimes when I have complicated decisions to make about Kathy's work, I don't believe in any of this, but I try to talk to her. I go, what do I do? And I very consistently, I get one message back from Kathy, which is, I don't care. I just don't want to be dead. And but of course she's dead, right?
Alas, I don't cry. Yeah, that's a lot.
You figure it out.
Leave me alone.
Yeah.
My dreams are weirdly spatial in a way. I think hers were as well. Like the dream maps really fascinate me with these convoluted, very Baroque architectures where spaces, sort of branch off and nest and fold back in these kinds of topological architectures. So I recognize that as a thing that goes on in my head too. But yeah, she only appeared that once. And I'm, I always thought I was a rational person, but it's like, wait a minute, a dream is sort of basically telling me I have to write this book, So there it is.
Well, it's a way of rationalizing, what you want to do anyway. So right. That's fine, no problem there. When you look at Kathy's work, right? I think anyone would see three fundamental things, right? One is the presence of dreams, dream work, dream logic, dream language, right? Kathy's own dreams, and we know from many people we know from the text themselves, but also people who have watched Kathy work, right? Whatever dreams she had that night would enter the text, whatever text she was writing that morning, right after, right? And there's countless examples of it in the text. The other thing that enters the texts is the ordinary, right? The everyday, a phone call, it's anything that interrupts the writing or happens at the same time, right? And the really visible things that often structure the entire work, right, is other texts, other books that are, Great Expectations, right? That are being written, not about, I would say writing through those works, sometimes just appropriating them or inhabiting them, but a similar thing, right, to what you're doing, right, which is your dream is there, the texts of Kathy's, right, are kind of reappearing, right, but also your real life, your body, right? Kathy's body, right, is part of that every day, right? Whatever she's doing with her body, masturbating sometimes, right? Which is a thing that students always notice right away when you read Kathy is like, oh my God, she's masturbating while and talking about it while she's writing.
I witnessed her do that. Yeah, that was real. Yeah.
Yeah.
And not an unprecedented method, right? Guyotat did that. For a signed female at birth person to do that, actually, it's probably not that common to actually explicitly write about it. But, yeah. Yeah, and her own, let's just say physical rhythms are in the writing as well, in really distinctive ways. Yeah, I'm interested in process and method, and how as a writer you develop those. And I did different ones, like there's different methods to, so I had an approach that was kind of like systematic. Like I read all of the books and arranged all of my favorite quotations by keyword.
Yeah.
And that took like 6 months, like creating this huge document. And two of my favorite quotes, I lost the source for. I just spent like 2 days like tracking it back down again, But it's like imposing a grid, but then to take it off. So then to organize the quotations into chunks so they all gather together under these keywords, and then sort of write that through as, so like distributed in a very different temporality. And temporality is a thing that she has a lot of thoughts about, right? A lot of her method is to do with times. So it's like, if you sort of interrupt the flow of the text and thread together the bits that connect that have been interspersed into it in a sort of a rhythm, you can actually kind of extract a different kind of Acker text out of it. And that's different, I think, to the ways other readers have approached her so far. So that struck me as, I can think a bit like that. Like I like a kind of much more limited and constraining method. Like I like the Olympian approach to things, which I think is not Kathy. It's not imitative in that sense, but it's sort of like, but I do have those sort of thoughts. Well, what would Kathy do? I'm not going to do the exact thing, but she would think about method. She would think about intention. So I'm going to do that, but I have a different method and I have a different intention. But I think that's a way that this can be a friend to that body and textual body as well. Yeah, so that's what was going on with it. Because it's like, how do you write about these sorts of writers? I think that's a question we don't ask often enough.
Very hard, you can't write about them the same way that you can write about, I don't know, Virginia Woolf or James Joyce or any 20th century writer.
I mean, do, but it turns out it's not interesting.
No, the thing that I have seen a lot in people writing about Kathy that's similar, but it's so restrictive, but it's people kind of keying into the families, right? The family romance, the triangles, which appear in all the books, right? And it's about the absent father who's not really a father, the impossible mother, right? Who nominally has all the power, but also is checked out in a different way and kills herself and abandons the child, and that which is Kathy's life, right? And it's fundamental in all the work. Yeah, you track those things, right? But they're one of the many things you're tracking, and you're not privileging them in the way that they often are privileged when, and I think the biographers they need a key to read Kathy by, so that's one of them.
Yeah, and it's sort of like, but why is that more important than class, or why is that more important than being a New Yorker? Like, why is that more important than being heart of an empire and growing up through the Vietnam War? Or, it seems I wanted to sort of level the playing field of the contexts rather than I'm not Freudian. I'm not interested in psychoanalysis all that much.
No, nor was Kathy. Right.
So why do that? Like I'm saying I did a different method, but I tried to kind of come up with the method after reading the book rather than before. I think that's a way of phrasing it, right? It's like, and it's a little bit, I would risk like an empiricism of like, I'm going to read the books first. Now, obviously I can't bracket off all my presuppositions about that. And I'm telling you, I have a history with this person, but I want the method and then the categories and the analysis to arise organically out of the field of textuality itself, and show you a way you could read it that, and while I honest, particularly some of these other readings that have happened, here's another thing you could get out of it And the reason to do that is not to say this reading is right, but like this body of text is so generative, you can keep coming up with different ways to read it, because there's more than 3-4 dimensions to it, you know. There's already these good books and several good articles on it, but it's like, let's keep going. Like, to me, that's what makes writing great, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think it happens because the family narratives, other than like the role of psychoanalysis and the emphasis we place on childhood and family, but it's so available. It's so available in the texts, right? It's available in the world. It's legible in all the work, right? In a way that it probably in the most fundamental way, right? Like it would be hard to escape a Kathy Acker text, right? Without kind of coming into that complicated family triangle, and seeing that the so you talked about concepts, but the other thing that happens in Kathy that's kind of Deleuzian are intensities, right? And that is one of the great intensities of Kathy's work, is that impacted, you know, family triangle that
and I want to say I learned a lot from Chris Krause's book about the story and fabulation about the story that Kathy used to do. And I also have learned a lot from the parts of Jason McBride's biography that I've read, because it's like, oh yeah, that's enormously helpful to have that. But I don't feel like biography is the truth of the work. Like, that's not how I think about literature at all. So I don't want to be, you know, like, I'm thankful that book and Book to Come exist and they're helpful. Because I started to doubt myself, you know, like, Kathy told me things that weren't true. And it's like, did I misremember that? And it's like, no, it's like she did this to other people. You know, there was a sense of the stories themselves started to have, you know, acquire a mythic quality at some point.
So I have to run downstairs because I have I have reality to deal with, which is my sewage line is broken and there's workers downstairs with jackhammers and I have to help them. But you know, perhaps what you could talk about in my absence is the memoir is so intense. It's so personal, and here's a line that I pulled out towards the end, right? Which is, you describe kind of, let's say, 2 phases with Kathy, which is the first phase where with Kathy you became that girl, and the latter phase, right, when you were in San Francisco and then in New York together, where you became this man, right? So it's this kind of play on gender, but also this and that, you know, which is quite powerful and elegant, and you're right, it points, right? So I'll be right back.
Oh, okay. Oh no, I'm left alone with the show. Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, I in retrospect, the moment where it was possible for me to imagine transition goes back to my encounter with Kathy, who, like, you know, was somebody who'd been living in San Francisco in the middle of, you know, like the 2nd or 3rd or 5th sexual revolution, right? Where, you know, there was a really quite practical, open-minded, creative, experimental approach to what both genders and sexualities could be that I wasn't ready for at all. But, you know, that was, and I don't give away too much about what's in the text, but, you know, like, Kathy's approach was, you know, problem with gender, like, we have tools for that. Like, we're, you know, yeah, there's ways you can fix that. I'm like, there are, you know. So I just found that kind of enormously enabling, but it was something that I kind of like put away and didn't know what to do with till later in my life. So part of returning to the body of work was trying to work through, I learned something there, but I didn't fully process it. Like, how do I do that? And that's a way then also to, I don't know, to be somebody's friend, even in death, even when they've left you, is, you know, like, thank you. This is what I learned. Like, you showed me all of these, you know, hinted at all of these things that were possible. And And I later figured them out and you know, became somebody else, became the person I needed to become. And then reading back through the Acker corpus, it struck me that, oh, they didn't come from nowhere, that there's, you know, it's like little bits of slippage and friction as to what genders the various Ackers are. And, you know, I don't like to be prescriptive about it, but you can find at least 5 genders in Kathy's body of work, yeah? Because to be a boy is different to being a man in Kathy's universe, and girls are different to women. They're not the same kind of human. That's how I read it anyway. These things are different, and it's rare that the language is imprecise about it. And the thing that's specific, for example, about the girl is that the girl is the figure whose power is other people's desire for her, which is the thing that will consistently get her hurt. But that's her only power, is the thing that then also threatens her possibility of existing, different to women. And so that gives you at least 4, you know, and then, you know, boys are not the same as men. And there are, you know, and I think in everyday life, there's moments and elements of Kathy being a boy and like wanting to be that, yeah. But not liking men. And so I think then sort of splitting the difference a little bit of desiring and not wanting men, of feeling boy as separate, of feeling herself being more than one gender. So yeah, I kind of think that's there in the text. People will report elements of that from her everyday life. I really think it's a really enabling for a reading of the life to not assume that she was cis, but without then imposing another gender on her that she never chose, yeah? Like she never described herself as a trans person. Like that never happened, in my knowledge, and it's not helpful to be imposing things. Trans people do this all the time. Like we read everybody as potentially us, but that's not what I want to do. But to take away the assumption that this was a cis person based on evidence from the life, and then you take away the assumption when you read the book that it's being written by a cis woman, it's being written by somebody where that's indeterminate. I think that's enormously helpful to kind of open up the book in lots of ways. And I've only mentioned 4 genders, like sometimes she's a 5th one, which isn't even human. So there's, you know, heading outside of, there's like a xeno gender sometimes appears in the text. And I think maybe in life sometimes as well, not in my experience of that, but so yeah, that was, you know, that it was enabling for me. And yeah, I kind of, and I organized an event called Trans Acker, with I think we had like 5 people plus a couple of people who couldn't come at the last minute. And the end of the book reads some of those contributions, and I've kind of imagined a couple that of people who couldn't actually come to kind of open up trans readings of Kathy, different to queer readings too. I think there's a very different register, and we pay attention to different things. It's a different kind of approach, and it's part of the separating out of those things.
I pulled up, I copied down this quote, and it's on page 33 and 34. And so it's not about the text, it's about you and Kathy, it's about your bodies, right? Every fuck is an orgy, even every hand job is always more, it's always more than one body, more than the 2 bodies or the 1 body if you're masturbating. So here's the beautiful passage. There is no such thing as a couple fucking. A body fucks another body, but it also fucks the concept of the body. The concept of a body is a gender. If the bodies that fuck are the same gender, then the 2 bodies that fuck are 3 bodies, the 2 bodies that one can observe plus masculinity, or the 2 bodies that one can observe plus femininity. Actually, when the 2 bodies of the same gender fuck, there are 4 bodies. The 2 bodies one can observe plus the concept of those bodies, its gender, plus the gender they are not, as each gender makes no sense without the one that it is not. Language has digital bits that bodies don't. If the bodies are of different genders, there are also 4 bodies, the 2 bodies that one can observe, plus the concept of each of those bodies, its gender. So it seems that when 2 bodies fuck, there are always 4 bodies fucking. It's It's a beautiful passage.
Yeah. And I got to admit, I'm quote unquote binary trans person. So it does sort of think around the poles. And I do acknowledge you can also think, outside the poles as well. Like, is there a non-binary reading? Non-binary reading of Kathy Acker would be a whole other thing that would be super interesting. I'm just not the person to actually do it. There's a thing in the chat about low theory, and I guess that's an example, right? Is to me low theory. Jack Halberstam also uses the term low theory. I think we thought of it independently about the same time because we're both readers of Stuart Hall, and it's what Stuart did. Yeah, it's like, how do you develop concepts directly out of practices that might use philosophy, but it's not attempting to be philosophy. It's attempting to be a concept to enable you to live. Which is in my mind is the sort of thing philosophy used to attempt to actually be. It would be a thing that would attempt to make you be able to live.
Definitely Greek philosophy, yeah.
And I think like a lot of people find Kathy's books that really do enable them to live. And a lot of that is affective, and it's got to do with it describing certain realities that people recognize. But part of it's also conceptual. It's like, oh yeah, like that's a concept of an experience and a way to process it and work with it and live. And that was the thing that I kind of wanted to do there.
Yeah.
And I'm using a bit of like classical Chinese philosophy is where the concept thing comes from. But when the book's out, people can have it that bit.
The low theory, here's a quote that I pulled on low theory: a philosophy for brutes, women, slaves, beasts, a philosophy whose skill is threading words together as its own kind of more carnal love. So yeah, lovely. The philosophy from below might be another way, right? Philosophy that you go into it with Plato, right? Philosophy, the love of wisdom, right? And Kathy so often has a love of the stupid.
Right. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And like we know she studied classics, and they keep coming up, and she's drawn to myth more than to philosophy.
Yes, she is.
Arguably. And there are a lot of classical characters kind of show up. And I sort of think part of that is looking even in, what we think of as our classical tradition for something that's not a kind of contemplative high theory of an aristocracy, of a slave-owning aristocracy, right? That's something else, and we get very, very few hints of what that classical thought from below would be like, but I think she's excavating it from myth or from Aristophanes, for example. And so, yeah, there's sort of, and the thing about low theory is you never kind of win because high theory has all the resources and all the power, but you're sort of carving out a little space so that in our everyday lives, we have access to concepts that make lives livable. Particularly at a time we're getting access to that through the universities, getting harder and harder because no one can afford it, no one gets jobs in it. So like, what are other practices and spaces? And she had one, right? She found a way to carve out a space as a writer who would be, among other things, a writer of concepts.
Right. Well, and she did that materially. She did that in three ways. She had a trust fund. It wasn't a giant trust fund. She still had to work. Yep. She was a gig worker, right? Very, very, in a way we would absolutely still recognize she was a gig worker. And then she made a tiny amount of money from the actual books, but clocking the royalties now, nobody could live on that money.
Yeah, it's true. And she's sort of like, I love the way I think she sometimes even inflated her class origins a little bit, which is such a great strategy, is actually come off a little richer than you actually were. Like there's this tendency to pretend you're like proletarian or something. Like I'm not, I'm solidly, like petite bourgeois from the provinces, right? But yeah, like Kathy told me that she was from Sutton Place, and it's like she's not. She's from the district, and like if you know New York, there's a little difference between those two things. Yeah.
No, she grew up on East 57. She grew up on the Upper East Side, but not on Sutton Place.
Not Sutton Place. So like I walked that entire district. I spent a whole day there doing like a psychogeography of it because we were there, like we were there in 97 or whatever. And I'm kind of like, like trying to get the feeling of it now that I know the city so much better. And I'm like, yeah, you're kind of, that was a great strategy, is like just pretend to actually be from an elite where you're sort of from a lower rung of it actually, rather than pretend to be, you know, something you're not, you know, son of the daughter of the working class. That ain't true. But yeah, that she was a gig worker, that she figured out how to craft appearances that got you to circulate in ways that generated work, and was very, I think, you know, calculated about that. Knew how to construct an image and slightly fluctuating images of herself. And I kind of see her descendants on Instagram, my friends, yeah, like working in gigs, like crafting appearances that that knowingly work, you know, certain veins of attention. And to me, the appearances that she created are part of the work, like the photographs she appeared for, the way she did readings and appearances and stuff. That to me is all part of it. In the same way as Oscar Wilde, right? Like it's sort of inseparable. The walking down the street with a calla lily, you know,
or Warhol as well, right?
A more direct influence, yeah, of like seeing that happen. And there's that nice anecdote about running into factory crowd people through sex work, because, you know, and her version of that was probably a minor part of her life, but there are people from the Warhol crowd, that was their real life, you know, that was where they were most of the time. So, and also that being honest and frank about the permeable boundary between artwork and sex work, particularly for women, which was, you know, she's not unique in having worked in versus sex work at that time. She's one of the few people who would talk about it. And I think we have slightly more frank conversations about that now.
Artwork, sex work, and fame work, which is another one of your categories.
Yeah, those are the three categories of practice that I talk about. We should have a break though. What do you think? And show a little
break. We're going to what we're showing in for our intermission is a clip of Kathy reading. I want to introduce it a little bit. It's shot in almost exactly the same time that McKenzie and Kathy met in Brisbane. It was shot in the studio by Jonathan Dawson.
It's literally days before we met.
Yeah, and it's Kathy reading one of the passages from In Memoriam to Identity, and this is the text she's reading. She read many times. I have more recordings of her reading this text than any other. It's the text. You go. It's the text that that I first got to know Kathy's work by, and so it was my kind of introduction to Kathy as well. And it's in a section of the book that's about Rimbaud and Verlaine, and it's about their romance, and it's about Kathy. It's about Kathy's intense identification with Rimbaud in particular, with the kind of hopeless love, with the young poet being in love with the old poet. The passage itself begins with Rimbaud. Kathy is writing in or as Rimbaud and reading that section, but Rimbaud channels or talks about Medea, right? Medea and Jason of being the woman to this king who has left her, right, for an advantageous marriage, which is parallel to what happened. You know, Verlaine was married and went back and forth between Rimbaud as his lover and his proper bourgeois wife. So that's the clip you're seeing. It's very, yeah. Want to take it away, Steph?
Yes, I will. Thanks, Matthias.
husband came from far away, Vikings, the first heroes who slashed into their own bodies, then drank down their own blood. I've inherited this love of blood, of tattooing. I'll be as ugly as one of them, for I know who I am. Don't show me your treasures, for I'd vomit over your antique Persian rug. My jewels are stained in blood. I don't have to work, he said as he took me. We rolled over each other on the kitchen floor. I fought my demon. Nights, always drunk, both of us. He dragged me out onto the public street. There or inside, he tried to frighten me into dying with his violence. This time he's going to thrust the knife into my heart. But that's not right. In those days, in those nights, he wanted to be thought a criminal. He used to talk a lot about death when he was being tender. He wasn't able to realize that he loved until that love had died. He wasn't able to realize that he had loved until he felt guilt and repentance in a dirty hole in the city. We would drink ourselves deeper, and he would begin to pity himself. Back on the public street, he kicked me down, then against a tree dog piss had stained. Then lifting up my body, hugged me. It was raining lightly. Then he strangled me until I passed out, and when I came to, became angry at me for letting him strangle me. Every gesture of his muscles revealed the gentleness of a girl at her catechism. That night, I followed him whenever he let me. I had to. Followed him into strange, complicated actions, very far, bad and good actions. But I was never allowed into his world. What was I to him? A fantasy. I gave him another identity. Whenever I lay next to him in a bed, and it was night, I was too excited to fall asleep, too unwilling to lose a chance that I might be allowed to enter his life. Since what he wanted was fantasy, what I wanted didn't matter. I asked myself if there was any chance he would change. Would he want to transmute this fantasy into reality? No. Change for him was fantastical. Yet I was, and still am, a victim of his charity. I was in him, as if he were the palace, a desolate palace. The palace had been shut down so that no one could see that a person as desolate as me was in it. I depended on him, but who could love the dependency of someone as lonely and as sad as me? So sadness is always renewed while perception dulls. I no longer saw the world. The world forgot me. Only his charity existed. When he kissed and hugged me as if he liked me, I entered a somber room named heaven. In this room, I was deaf, dumb, and blind, and I never wanted to leave. Here, I took the habit. We were two children, freely wandering around in and massacring the paradise of sorrow. We were together. But after he had penetrated me, Verlaine said, "All this is going to amuse you after I'm gone, when your arms will no longer hang around my neck, when you'll no longer rest inside me, when your lips will no longer touch my pupils, because I'm going to have to go and not come back. There are other people I care for. I have duty, although that isn't exactly what I want, darling." I saw myself. He had just gone. Suicide. I looked up at Verlaine. I begged him to never leave me. He said he wouldn't. I made him promise this 20 times. I knew it meant as much as when I had said that I didn't want him to leave his wife. Sometimes I forget this insoluble mess. and dream. He'll save me. We'll travel. We'll hunt in the deserts. We'll sleep on the pavements of strange cities, carelessly, without his guilt, without my pain. Or else I'm going to wake up and all the human laws and customs of this world will have changed, thanks to some magical power. Or else this world, without changing, will let me feel desire and be happy and carefree. What did I want from him who hurt me more than I thought it possible for two people to hurt each other? I wanted the adventures found in kids' books. He couldn't give me these because he wasn't able to. Whatever did he want from me? I never understood. He told me he was just average. Average regrets, average hopes. What the fuck do I care about all that average shit that has nothing to do with adventure? Did he talk to God? No. I should talk to God and tell God that I'm living in the bottom of an abyss, and here there is no prayer. As for talking to him, he avoids me, denigrates me. Once upon a time, I would say to him, you were as wild as me. You thought that all straight men were the playthings of nature in a grotesque delirium. You laughed at straight men hideously for a long time. Hiding in the closet, you became so perverted, you had to become straighter than a straight man. If you had acted less perversely, you wouldn't have had to become so straight, get married, and we could have stayed together longer. Your tenderness to me was mortal, but I'm a slave to you. I'm mad. One day, perhaps, miraculously, you'll disappear, you'll die. But then, since I don't believe in murder, I'm gonna go with you. When you go to heaven, I'll be there to witness your assumption. Ours is a strange kind of marriage. These ended Medea's words. Medea killed the woman Jason was about to marry, and then she killed the children Jason had given her. She couldn't kill Jason. As she sat on the palace roof, amid flames as fierce as her love, a chariot of snakes carried her away from Jason and into safety. Now Jason wandered homeless from city to city, and everyone hated him. But Medea didn't die. She became immortal and reigned in the fields of heaven. But I, Rimbaud, Arthur Rimbaud, I love Verlaine.
Hi there, everybody. We back? Just having a little snack in the break there.
We're back. I'm making avocado toast.
Oh, I'm eating pistachios mixed with raisins. That is amazing. I'm kind of like, I'm now thinking of that whole piece as allegory for the relationship I had with Kathy 3 days later or whatever. Because it's like, oh my God, yeah, I was the fucking Verlaine and Jason to someone who was just way too magnificent for me to process. This is obviously ridiculous, but you know, that's how I was feeling when I was watching it.
Yeah, I mean, this particular recording is the best reading that I have at this point in time of Kathy, but I also knew that this was the right Kathy reading.
Yeah, and shout out to the memory of Nick Zerbrugg, who was responsible really for getting it to Brisbane, and Nick Sudis, who got it to Art Space in Sydney as an Hollywood Art Space. Yeah, and she had fans in Australia and people who like really loved and understood her work.
Yeah, it still does. Yeah.
It is a powerful reading though, and it's that she was so good at reading as well. Is worth mentioning. Like the text, actually, it helps to read the text if you've heard her read, because there's a way that there's a sort of like simplifying of some of the sentences that editors don't let you get away with usually. They want to put in all of the bric-a-brac of articles and stuff, and she doesn't, but the sentences read really beautifully if you think of it in terms of the breath and the articulation and the accent. Love that New York accent, you know, the word long is itself long when she says it, accent that she never lost. Yeah, she read so well and was captivating to me. I heard her read to like 10 people in a bookstore. Yeah, in Sydney. I didn't go to her big reading in Sydney, and she was mad at me about that, but it sold out.
The I have jackhammering outside my window. I hope it just somebody send me a note if it's too much.
Fine. Yeah.
She was an excellent reader. She wasn't always an excellent reader. We have earlier videotapes where she's kind of like looking down at a piece of paper and mumbling. So she became an excellent reader and a performer. And
not well, all poets and writers out there who do readings. Like there is no excuse for being bad at this shit.
Practice. The one of the most successful parts, if I do say so myself, of the exhibition I curated is I put in 2 monitors this recording and another one a few years earlier of the same text, which is, so this one was in front of a camera, right? There's no audience, it's a studio, right? And the other one was in front of a big audience at the kitchen in New York. And the readings, the contrast and the comparison of the 2 readings is astonishing. You learn so much about Kathy. And I agree with you that I did not fully understand how to read Kathy's text until I heard Kathy read Kathy's text.
Yeah, and if you imagine with, and she writes that somewhere of writing around the breath points. Like there's things she learns from poets, but she does not write poetry. But there's a way you think about the breath in relation to the text. It's very important. And then there's that great bit in Eileen Miles' not particularly sympathetic portrait of Kathy about, we're on these readings and we all had 10 minutes and she always read for 20 and it worked. And it's like, sorry, I know you're an astonishing reader, but
all of Kathy's contemporaries have complicated relationships to Kathy and salty anecdotes.
She was difficult.
To
say the least.
Not so much for me, and I think not so much for you, but
no, because I wasn't a rival,
right?
In any way. Like that was why it was possible. Neither a fan nor a rival. You know, I was just I was young, quite a bit younger than her. She's born in 47. I'm born in 61, so that's the difference. I'm now older than she was when she passed. So I have a sort of perspective. I couldn't write about it till I had that perspective. Also, I think Me
too. So one of the things we are opening this up to questions, and if I'm going to monitor the chat if they come in, but otherwise we can. There's endless stuff. We haven't even gotten into the main body of the text. All right, here's a question on reading, writing, and working with the material. In this case, translation. Could we both speak a bit on the Persian poems in Blood and Guts? her process, her relationship with language, etc. That's a big question.
You did a magnificent reading of that with who, and I'm blanking on the person who read the Persian
Sarah
side.
Mamani in New York at Performance Space New York, PS1.
Right. Read back to back.
Back to back.
I read the Farsi and read the English. Yeah.
Farsi and English.
Really brought that alive for me.
The do you want to talk about it for a minute, and I will pull up a page from the text. All right.
Yeah, and I don't read Farsi, so what I can say about that is extremely limited. People who do see it as sort of a beginner level attempting to learn a language, and that it would be Farsi at a time when Iran was becoming like the bad other is not irrelevant at all. There's also bits of Arabic in other books, right? There's a sense of the language of the other coming into the text. There's a thing about how pronouns work in that as well, maybe, and the articulation of the statement about self or other in a language that's structured differently that interests me. My understanding is Farsi doesn't have gendered pronouns. Everything's in it, but again, not an expert. So I find that really kind of interesting. And I also think about this in relation to Ornette Coleman, picking up the violin, having this astonishing career as a saxophonist, and then just picking up the violin and seeing what's possible in a language that that you attempt to learn. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I wish we could do a reading from it, but it works best when somebody can read the Persian. So what I know from Persian speakers is Kathy learned Persian. She taught herself Persian, and we have her Persian grammar books that are in her library, but also, of course, made mistakes.
Yes, there's things wrong, I'm told, in this. Yeah,
there's things wrong, and what remains to be kind of untangled are deliberate and it's not beyond.
Shout out to Lala Khalili, who helped me with this. I didn't write about it in the book, but I sent these pages to Lala to give me some perspective on it.
Yeah. And Sarah Mamani was the person who helped me with this. And I think Sarah's writing about it as well. And Sarah Mamani, by the way, to plug her, has a rewriting of the Persian poems called "The Streets Are Black," which is one of the lines, and it's astonishing, and it needs to be published if there's any publishers out there. But this is a typical page, right? This is it got copied. This is Kathy's handwriting. It got copied into Blood and Guts. From these manuscripts. The Blood and Guts itself is like many of Kathy's books, but it's her most famous book. But it's also it's a compilation of different parts, right? That she had been writing, and which is something Kathy always did. That she had no master plan of a novel with a plot with 2 characters or 5 characters, right, that would carry through an arc and end. It was always a collection of parts.
Sometimes the parts sort of build and differentiate off each other, and sometimes they're sort of juxtaposed. And this one's more juxtaposed, I feel. And it's and Georgina Colby's written about this, right? Because she's more interested in the physicality of the process and stuff. And went through the archive and she picked, I think, 5 texts or roughly, and this was one of them because there's documentation of the stages, and there's a huge exercise book this is in, right? That's sort of like the page proof of it. So we don't have material for some of the books, but the ones where we do, she went through the process. There's a second part to this question from another person. Did I say irresponsible criticism? I don't think that would be I'm trying to be, responsible is maybe not the word. Like, I'm trying to be a friend to Kathy's memory and for my book to be a friend to her book. And Also maybe comrade would be another word that I'd use. I use that word very sparingly, actually, but I'd use it here. So there are ways that this book is, the relation is horizontal. And like, thank you for this image, because like, why did I not connect top and bottom to low and high? Like I didn't do that, and that's going. Thank God I haven't signed off on the manuscript of this book yet. But I'm not trying to top the book in the sense of knowing it better than it knows itself, because that's a conceit criticism got into because of psychoanalysis, right? Where it's like, oh, well, obviously the author has no idea what they're doing, and I agree with that, but that then you would be the one who would know as the critic. It's like, honey, just nah. I don't buy that. So I don't think it's irresponsible, but it is like is the opposite of authoritative, irresponsible? I don't think so at all. I think it's friendship, yeah, it's comradeship. It could also be like an erotic relation to another text, and that's part of this one. I wouldn't obviously do that with some other writing. Yeah, so I think it's more, yeah, can we think different relations to writers that we're writing about, other than the ones we inherit from a sort of certain kind of literary critical tradition. I think writing about art helps with that a little bit, because there's a way in which I think there's been a lot more interesting ways people have thought about writing about art. One of those people was Kathy. Ekphrasis is the technical term. Georgina Colby's also interesting on this. The way Kathy, a lot of what she's doing is writing through another work of art, like through the Dario Argento film, right? It's Suspira, yeah. It's like there's a whole, like chunk of a book that is, a version of that, but it's not an analysis. It's not, yeah, it's like in friendly relation to another artwork. Oh, yeah, I can't answer questions about the Farsi because I don't, it's not a language I have. But yes, hopefully Sarah will write about that. And so like for an Anglophone writer, with Greek and some French to be, engaging with Arabic and Farsi in a time when the United States was making these, the bad other, is I think super interesting and opens a kind of a door. And for that to be understood as a sort of modest and friendly gesture that can, I think that's sort of really interesting, and I hope that's where that goes.
The Kathy's attention to the Middle East, Islam, terrorism, at a point it was prescient, and the other thing is that Kathy has an image of the bombing of the World Trade Center in an early work, the burning bombing of America. So
yeah.
Kathy was very attuned, right? Attuned to the world, the big world, right? Maybe not so well attuned to the
I mean, I
world harder.
I got to say, I hate everything about Ezra Pound, but Pound said artists are the antennae of a culture, and to me that's very real, and she was in so many interesting ways. All right, so I'm going to read question 4. I'd be curious to hear either both of your thoughts on my favorite Acker quote. I think it's from Don Quixote. It goes something like, sex is important because sex breaks the rational mind. It's not the only thing that does in Acker, like bodybuilding's another one that's sort of really interesting. And I started a gym habit to understand that side of her. And being such a femme, I don't really have any interest in doing it with the intensity she did, but that was another. So it's not uniquely about sex, but I think she's interested in ways out of what the rational mind thinks it is. And the rational mind in Acker is often also quite crazed and megalomaniacal and imperialist, among other things. So yeah, but definitely sex is a place where sometimes, but not always, that happens. Then one of the categories of bad sex in Acker is where you don't get out of your head. Like I think I recognize dissociation in sex in Acker. I think a lot of trans people can relate too hard. Like she's an interesting writer of that, of the when that fails. But I think like searching for that and almost like a drug of kind of like needing that way in which sex kind of done with a certain intensity gets you out of that. And then, but how do you write about the experiences that are about the dissolution of the self? Is a whole problem that I think she has very interesting approaches to, really.
The something that there's a lot of in your book is Kathy's relationship to reason and rationalism, and it's not that she's anti-rational, but she's very suspicious of reason and rationality as kind of instrumental, as instrumentalized things that compel us to engage in an intolerable exploitive capitalist culture, and that you know that I think is a very good reading of Kathy, and a reading I haven't seen before of Kathy.
I'm just trying to read what Arnie just put in there. I'm curious in this context about what, Matthias, you said in your intro about a philosophy of nature. Yeah, should we get into that one?
Yeah, it's the conclusion. It's the conclusion, actually. It's the end of the, well, there's an afterword, right, which we talked about, but it's the last section of first, second, and third philosophy. And it surprised me. I think it surprised you, right? Yeah. And it's not nature in the pastoral way that you might think of nature appearing in a literary work, right?
Yeah, and like one of her questions, and I'll come back to questions in a minute, but is nature horror is one of the structuring questions there. Because I think there is a kind of ontology of chaos, if you like, going on, and where there's a very careful picking through of whether that's is that nature and then is that horror, is a set of questions that occur, and you know, is anything survivable past the destruction of nature in another register is another thing that I think is going on wherever that comes up. And it's sort of keyed to, I think, to those two things, to nature as a category that you could extract from myth, that myth is in touch with something primordial, but also nature is the thing that's disappearing. And I think she's well aware of that. I think even mentions like climate change once, which is kind of so unusual for writing at that time as our undoing. But I wanted to just back up a little bit to her questions. One of the things that made me think about Acker as a theorist is that the whole thing is just studded with deeply philosophical questions, yeah? And none of which I'm going to remember now, but like, you know, like one of them is along the lines of, you know, if something happened to me and I don't remember it, did it happen? And it's like, well, that's a philosophical question. Like that's a actually quite profound theoretical question that you attempt to answer. and you know, I extracted, I don't know, like 20 or 30 questions that she poses, and sometimes they're not answered. Like it sort of like pops up in the text in the middle of a description that gave rise to it. So to what extent do certain experiences of everyday life give way to questions that will require a concept as their answer? Struck me as really kind of key.
The Marquis de Sade is very much like this too. It is very overtly, you know, pornography and philosophy in a way that's impossible to untangle. Here's a passage that I had pulled out very near the end about nature, and it illustrates kind of the weaving of your words and her words. Begins with you. The last god, the last dead god, might be nature. It's a hard word to do without, as it means so many contradictory things. The nature that is dead might in the first instance be the one that appears as separate to man, a thing apart, that man can penetrate and order and control, a control which paradoxically also then considers itself natural. Quote, in this century, what we know as natural, our conquerors have invented as their identities and used as tools to control us. That's from Literal Madness, which is 3 books. I can't figure out which one it is. Rather than being the anchor of meaning, maybe, Kathy again, rather than being the anchor of meaning, maybe nature is that which always confuses it. Language itself might be in nature, but any use of language about nature remains outside of it. The girl, that was you. This is Kathy. The girl is thinking that most people are saying the human world is ending. This landscape without any given meaning is as present as any statement as the world that is about to end. Also from Literal Madness.
Yeah, and it's we've been trying to look for a style of including the references in the text without making it too disruptive. There's been a whole Duke University Press doing the book, by the way. I think we've worked on that whole paragraph. Reminds me of Raymond Williams in Keywords says nature is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. The other one he says that about is culture, interestingly. And so it's then trying to like sort out, you can see Kathy trying to sort out the different senses of like nature means too many things and they're contradictory. But she's sort of like working on that. And which is for a writer so much of the city is interesting that it's not pastoral, because that's where, and there's a whole literature as the writer of the city. And then with their, like sojourns to the country is like a whole freaking genre. And she doesn't do it, which I think is kind of really interesting. But it's to this whole series of questions about whether nature's actually there, ever was there, or is disappearing if it was, is the sort of set of questions. And it's sort of, it is occasionally apocalyptic, but it's not reducible to that, which is what I find very, very contemporary, that she was sort of picking up that, the antenna was picking up those signals in the 90s as to how we think about these things now.
And animals, right, which don't figure so much in your text, but there are persistently animals in the work that Kathy is super attentive to, right? And so sometimes there's stuffed animal, right, which is the category of animal, right? But the non-human life, right?
Yeah, I think I did animals. I certainly do like mythic things. I had things to say about that. Yeah, it's true. And transforming into animals happens a lot.
Becoming animal. Yeah.
Yep. That's a whole deal, and particularly through sex. Those pages are super hot too, by the way. Yeah, it's so funny. I was like collecting all the quotes, like having such different like relations to the different like chunks of it, and then sorting them out. It's kind of like a really interesting exercise to, and I think it probably wouldn't work with a lot of other writers, but to find, it's like she's sort of writing in chords, and you're like separating out the notes of the chords a little bit.
Yeah, no, but also. It's doable. It's very doable with Kathy because the texts are so heterogeneous, right? There is no unified text in Kathy ever. Even the essays, right? And the heterogeneity of those texts kind of invites invites this reorganization, right?
Yeah, because it's a thing I think people find a little frustrating about her books, because it's hard to, but once you let yourself love it, it's like, wait a minute, this was like a sentence about having really bad sex with some guy, and now it's about a philosopher, and then it's about some character from literature, and one of those changes happened in a sentence, and then you've like jumped to another register between 2 sentences altogether. Like both of those kinds of changes can happen, and it's sort of, you really sort of have to let something in your own reading self go in order to do that. And I think that's really intentional, is to sort of try to oblige you to let go of a version of yourself that wants to be a kind of a straight line of selfhood, reading through somebody else's straight line of selfhood. That's the relation between reader and writer. And it just doesn't offer you that. And people find that frustrating. It offers you this completely other thing that and it took me a while to get into it, but yeah, I kind of read all of the books back to back over and over. And at some point I'm like, oh, I get it. This is actually pleasurable. I actually enjoy this.
Yeah, very, very similar process for me. Also, like, have you taught Kathy at all yet?
I taught a whole course.
You did?
I only done once, and made some converts too, which I was very happy about. And I get lost in like very short pieces of text. Like you're just like, oh, wait a minute, there's like 4 or 5 things going on just in this paragraph. Let's just look at that.
Yeah, I've struggled. I've struggled with teaching Kathy. For a while I was running for undergrads an ABC course, Acker, Burroughs, and John Cage, and that they and it was also that was 15 years ago. That was right after Kathy died, and it was a way of me also like having to organize my thoughts about Kathy's work, and maybe it would be easier, but something has changed with Kathy. Like I think Kathy is more readable in this century than she was in her time.
Yeah, and it's like it does read a little bit like your Twitter feed. And that's, I find something quite contemporary about that sense of, like chunks of information being juxtaposed, and the book not being the opposite of that, but embracing it, seems quite contemporary to me. And I actually did a different version of that in Reverse Cowgirl, where I did it more where I want the quotes attached to the proper names they're associated with. It sort of intervenes. As if you're reading my books, when you get bored with me, like here's an actual quote from Kathy is one of the people that I shoved in. And there's so many things about the writing work, fame work, sex work, that you're doing all of those things to survive, all at the same time. That seemed really kind of very, very contemporary, and I think people find themselves in that. Also, like we're a lot more open, but maybe not always in the best way, about things like sexual violence, and that's very front and center. And I think for some readers that's a deal breaker, and it's a reason the text isn't available, which I totally understand. But for some readers that's really enabling, that here's somebody who's going to like not leave that part out, but is also not going to treat it in certain sort of now generic ways.
Do you do trigger warnings? I do trigger warnings. Do you do trigger warnings?
Oh yeah, I don't call them that, but I always.
I don't call them that either. I just say, by the way,
Yeah, like if you say it's a trigger warning, that is it self-triggering. Like that doesn't help. But yeah, I do try to let people know what's going to be in there, and I did that with this material. Which was confronting for some students, and some chose not to read certain parts, but that's fine. Yeah.
I even do it in my pornography class, which is kind of astonishing because, why are you in there? But
yeah, wouldn't you want one just for the entire course? It's like,
So I'm not seeing questions percolating up. The one thing that we can wrap up soon.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, we had a good long run.
We had a good run. It was good while it lasted.
It's always a pleasure talking to you about this, by the way.
Lovely.
Yeah.
It really, we can do this again and again, and probably we will.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you. When is the book out?
It's out in this fall. Philosophy for Spiders on the Low Theory of Kathy Acker with Duke University Press. Thank you, Duke.
Do you have a cover yet?
No. And we thought of the Tarantula cover, but you're using that for something.
Yeah.
Second choice is maybe the famous Kathy Brew picture. Been used before, but I was on the back of that bike, and I know that look. She was wearing clothes at the time. I saw her when it was cold. But, I think maybe that, because I love that image.
This I wanted to show anyway, but this is the first cover. There's 2 covers of this book, and this cover didn't last very long, but this is a cover it is an astonishing piece of design and understanding of what Kathy's up to and everything else. And yeah, I'm editing a book on Kathy drawn from the symposium and the exhibition, and some version of this will be the cover. And then I just want to show you the second cover because it's also interesting. One of the things I do want to say before we end is that the theme of the spider and the web, right, which sort of begins here, right? Yeah. You actually use it very lightly, right? Yeah. It's a very light touch, right? It's a simple. You don't try to wring too much out of it, and this black tarantula moment, and I want to call your attention to everybody's attention to that Kathy's first book was not by Kathy Acker. It was by the black tarantula, right? So Kathy's sort of spiderness is incredibly deliberate and obviously performative, and passed very quickly. She was the black tarantula for 2 years, and then she became Kathy Acker.
Yeah, I didn't want to push too hard on that image. Martine Scalino, I think is her name, is a scholar who talks about the figure of the kleptoparasite, which is spiders that come into other spiders' nests and eat the prey that they've wrapped up in threads and stuff. And Martine uses that as an image for how Kathy processes other texts. And I use that, was kind of where I got it from. So thank you, Martine, wherever you are.
Well, thank you everyone who was in this room. We can't see you, but what a lovely thing to get to do. Thank you.
Bye, hon.
Bye, hon.
Thank you, CalArts.